So, Marky is Invincible and Anissa's son, and his story actually begins long before he was even born. It all started when Frag ordered all the pure-blooded Viltrumites to settle on Earth. Their mission was clear: interbreed with the human population to replenish the nearly extinct Viltrumite race. However, the political landscape of the Empire shifted drastically when it was revealed that Nolan was actually the direct descendant of Lord Argul. This revelation meant that Nolan, not Frag, was the rightful ruler the Viltrumites had been searching for over thousands of years. Upon learning that Frag had attempted to assassinate the true heir to keep his power, the pure-blooded Viltrumites, including Anissa, turned on Frag and nearly killed him. With Nolan now established as the leader of the Viltrumites on Earth, Anissa's focus shifted. She realized that Nolan's son carried the sacred royal blood within him, making his genetic potential the most valuable in the entire universe. Her interest in Mark quickly evolved from professional observation to a cold, calculated obsession. She began to shadow Invincible, stalking him from the periphery of his life. Her presence was finally felt during the Guardians of the Globe's intense battle against Dr. Seismic. In a display of raw power, reminiscent of her initial arrival on Earth, she tore through a massive magma mite summoned by Seismic, effectively ending the threat in an instant. Shocked by the sudden intervention, Mark flew into the atmosphere to confront the mysterious helper, only to find Anissa waiting for him. When Mark questioned her motives, noting that he had seen her watching both him and his father, Anissa sharply rebuffed him. She clarified that her interest was strictly on Mark, not Nolan. Before departing, she forced a kiss upon him, leaving Mark surprised and visibly dismayed, and flew off with the chilling promise that they would see each other again. Then, 6 months later, Anissa tracked down Mark, following his return from an alternate dimension where he had been trapped by a robot. While trying to reunite with his family, Mark was intercepted by Anissa. She demanded to know where he had been, but before he could even finish his explanation, she cut him off to discuss the Viltrumite breeding mission. Anissa confessed that she had been struggling to fulfill her duty of procreating with humans. She told Mark that, despite his youth and what she perceived as his relative weakness, she had decided to settle on mating with him because of the purity of his royal Viltrumite heritage. Mark, disgusted and focused on finding Robot and returning to Eve, attempted to fly away. However, Anissa was not finished. She intercepted his flight path, physically preventing him from leaving. Mark pleaded with her to leave him alone, stating clearly that he had no interest in fighting. But Anissa retorted that she didn't want a battle either. She simply couldn't stall the mission any longer. She noted that while Nolan was not as tyrannical as Frag, the directive to repopulate the species remained an active and mandatory order. She then tried to seduce Mark, but after her attempts of seduction failed, Anissa lost all patience. In a sudden burst of violence, she headbutted Mark. Realizing that he would never consent, she decided to use her superior strength to force herself onto him. Mark begged her to stop and tried to fight her off, but Anissa, a seasoned warrior with centuries of experience, seemed to almost enjoy the struggle. She caught Mark's punch, noting with a predatory curiosity that he had grown stronger since their last meeting, but she still managed to overpower him. The two spiraled out of the sky, crashing into a secluded, unknown farm. Pinned under her weight, Mark continued to resist, but Anissa used her elbow to pin his neck, demanding he stop struggling. As Mark watched in horror, the situation escalated into a brutal assault. Anissa tore away their costumes and forcefully violated him, completely indifferent to his pleas. While Mark was left physically and mentally shattered by the experience, Anissa appeared coldly satisfied, even aroused by the act. As Mark lay in the dirt, traumatized and weeping, Anissa showed no remorse. She told him to man up and warned him that it would likely take several more attempts for her to conceive, implying that this nightmare was far from over. To understand why Anissa committed such a heinous act, one must look at the cold, predatory nature of Viltrumite culture. Historically, Viltrumites are effectively apophyromantic. They perceive romantic love and deep emotional connections as a form of frailty. In their eyes, love is a human weakness that obstructs a warrior from achieving their maximum potential in power and honor. Consequently, Both genders of the species traditionally viewed their mates solely as convenient sources of entertainment for procreation or as sparring partners to assess their ever-increasing strength. A Viltrumite was only attracted to a partner's unique power and their potential to produce even stronger offspring. So, for Anissa, Mark wasn't a person to be loved, but a royal bloodline to be harvested and a challenge to be overcome. So, while Mark was left deeply traumatized by the experience, Anissa had successfully conceived. In a rare moment of discretion, she kept the identity of the father a total secret, never revealing to the other Viltrumites that the child belonged to the son of their emperor. Then Mark left Earth to escape the iron-fisted rule of Robot, and Anissa gave birth to their son, whom she named Marky. For the first few years of his life, Marky was raised in the shadow of a secret that could upend the fragile peace between Earth and the Viltrumite survivors. However, life on Earth began to have an unforeseen effect on Anissa. Just as Nolan Grayson had been softened by his time with Debbie, Anissa found her rigid Viltrumite pride slowly chipping away. During Mark's absence from the planet, she crossed paths with a human named Scott Murphy. Against every instinct she had been bred with, she genuinely fell in love with him. This shift marked a radical departure from her past. She moved in with Scott and eventually gave birth to a daughter named Tessa. In this new domestic setting, Anissa attempted to build a normal life, one built on the very emotional connections she once despised. Growing up in this household, Marky had no reason to suspect his true lineage. He lived under the impression that Scott Murphy was his biological father, seeing himself as a normal part of a blended, super-powered family. Despite his Viltrumite heritage, Marky possessed a protective and gentle spirit, traits he inherited from his real father and learned from his adopted father Scott. He took great pride in caring for his younger sister, Tessa, and spent much of his childhood waiting by the window for his mother to return from her various Viltrumite missions. The fragile peace of Marky's childhood was shattered when the Viltrumite War reached its bloody climax. As Anissa left Earth to join the coalition against Grand Regent Frag and his relentless army of Fraxan Viltrumite hybrids, the world fell into the shadow of Robot's authoritarian rule. In a strategic move to maintain leverage over the Viltrumites, Robot kidnapped Marky and his sister. Though Marky possessed the dormant potential of the Viltrumites, his powers were not developed and his efforts to resist were completely worthless against the mechanical precision of Robot's advanced drones. It was only after the war ended and the Viltrumite children were finally rescued that Marky learned the devastating truth. His mother had fallen in battle. In the wake of the tragedy, Marky met Invincible for the first time and desperately asked him if the news of his mother's death was truly final. When he returned home to Scott, the weight of his grief became an unbearable burden. Unable to process the loss, Marky spiraled into a violent breakdown, destroying his toys and locking himself in his room as he tried to shut out a world that no longer made sense. Scott, grieving his own loss, attempted to comfort the boy, telling him how much he missed Anissa. The sheer intensity of Marky's sorrow acted as a catalyst, and in a sudden, violent burst, his Viltrumite powers finally kicked in. With no training and no control, he tore through his home and took to the skies. Terrified and moving at speeds he couldn't comprehend, Marky careened into the city, leaving a trail of property damage. The chaos quickly drew the attention of the Immortal, who contacted Invincible. As the police arrived on the scene, they found a frightened child who had become a living weapon. They ordered Marky to surrender, but the boy was paralyzed by fear, unable to figure out how to stop his flight or his strength. Every panicked movement only caused more destruction. When the officers, fearing for the public's safety, opened fire, the bullets simply flattened against Marky's skin, proving useless against his developing Viltrumite invulnerability. Just as the situation reached a breaking point, Invincible and Atom Eve arrived. Eve acted instantly, manifesting an energy barrier to intercept the hail of gunfire, while Invincible swooped in to secure the boy. He grabbed Marky and flew him straight into the upper atmosphere, away from the prying eyes of the public and the danger of the city below. Marky, not knowing who the stranger was, began to lash out and resist, screaming for Invincible to let him go. Realizing that the only way to calm the boy's spiraling panic was the truth, Mark looked him in the eyes and revealed that he was Marky's real father. The revelation hit Marky hard. The shock, combined with the trauma of his mother's death, caused him to lose consciousness within seconds. As his body went limp, Eve flew up to catch him, gently transporting him to the safety of the Pentagon for medical observation. Shortly after, he woke up, and Scott arrived to check on his son. Overwhelmed with guilt, Scott confessed to Eve that he deeply regretted not telling Marky about the circumstances of his birth and his Viltrumite heritage much earlier. Eve reassured him that there was no need for such heavy regret. Marky was safe, and he would stay with them only until he learned to master his powers. As the time came for the Viltrumites to depart Earth under their new direction, Mark sought out Marky one last time to ground the boy in his true history. He sat him down to tell the story of the Viltrumite Empire, a tale not of heroes, but of a species that had nearly destroyed itself in the pursuit of conquest. Mark explained that Marky's grandfather, Nolan, was born into a society that valued strength above all else. Thousands of years ago, the Viltrumites engaged in a brutal civil war, slaughtering the weak among their own kind until only the most ruthless and powerful survived. This purging created the unstoppable warriors they are today. Once they had perfected their race through genocide, the Viltrumites turned their sights toward the stars. They established the Viltrum Empire, a force that expanded at an astounding rate for thousands of years. They seemed invincible until their enemies, led by the coalition of planets, developed the Scourge virus, a biological weapon specifically engineered to target Viltrumite DNA. The virus didn't just kill, it ravaged their civilization for years. The death toll was so catastrophic that the billions of bodies cast into orbit eventually formed a literal ring around the planet, and it became a silent monument that reminded every survivor of how close they came to total extinction. By the time the virus ran its course, the Empire had lost all of its population. With only a handful of pure-blooded Viltrumites remaining, Thrag's singular mission was to ensure the survival of the species and to locate the long-lost heir of King Argol. To do this, he sent sleeper agents to various worlds to test biological compatibility with other species. This was the very mission that brought his grandfather to Earth, leading to his life with Debbie and, eventually, the birth of Mark himself. Mark looked at Marky, seeing the same confusion he once felt, and admitted that he had no idea he was a Viltrumite until his father sat him down and told him everything, just like he's doing now. He told Marky he was lucky, because Nolan told him before his powers kicked in, so he had time to process it. Mark also spoke of the conflict that followed, how he and Nolan fought because Nolan wanted to conquer Earth for the Empire, while Mark chose to protect it. Nolan's reign was a rare era of peace, defined by his attempt to show the mercy he had learned on Earth. It was that very compassion that led Nolan to spare Thrag's life, a decision that tragically allowed Thrag to return and eventually kill him. Mark shared how he had to avenge his father and take up the mantle of Emperor himself. Now, as the leader of the new Viltrumite Empire, Mark promised his son that he would continue to lead by Nolan's final example. He wanted to prove to the galaxy that being a Viltrumite didn't have to mean being a conqueror. They could finally be a force for good in a universe that had feared them for millennia. Before departing Earth to lead the Viltrumite Empire into a new era, Mark took a moment to offer a sincere apology to Marky. He explained that his absence wasn't due to a lack of love, but because of the deeply traumatic and complicated history he shared with Marky's mother, a past that made it difficult for him to face the boy without being reminded of his own pain. As the Viltrumite fleet ascended, Mark gave a final nod to Scott, thanking him for raising the boy, and left Marky with a final charge: protect his sister, honor his father, and master the incredible powers flowing through his veins. A year or two later, Marky's grandmother, Debbie Grayson, decided to surprise him with a trip to a tailor shop owned by Art Rosenbaum. Initially bored by the prospect of a suit fitting, Marky's eyes lit up when Art revealed his secret history. He was the man who had designed the iconic costumes for both Nolan and Mark. The idea of wearing an official superhero suit transformed Marky's boredom into pure excitement. Shortly after, while flight testing his new gear, he stumbled upon a battle involving Monster Girl and other heroes against a massive beast. Despite their warnings to stay back, Marky dove into the fray, eager to prove his worth. His Viltrumite strength allowed him to land some blows, but the battle ended unexpectedly when Darkwing, who was missing since the Invincible War, suddenly emerged from within the monster. When the dust settled, Marky introduced himself, and the heroes were shocked to realize that he was Invincible's son. When asked for his name, he confidently declared that he would go by Kid Invincible. That night, after finishing his responsibilities at home, he flew to the grave of his grandfather. In a quiet moment of reflection, he admitted that while his father chose the name Invincible because it was how he felt, Marky chose it for a different reason, because it was what he had to be if he was ever going to live up to the impossible legacy of the Grayson name. Over the following decades, Marky became Earth's steadfast guardian, battling countless villains and upholding the peace. However, as the years stretched on, the pressure began to take its toll. When his adoptive father, Scott, eventually passed away, Marky spiraled into a deep depression. Despite his outward worship of Mark, knowing everything Mark had done to save the universe, a bitter resentment began to fester. He couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's distance was a sign that he never truly loved him because of the circumstances of his birth. He watched from afar as his half-sister, Terra, lived a life of royalty and adventure by their father's sin while he felt relegated to Earth. This perceived favoritism and the weight of being an enforced child kept growing. Eventually, the silence became too much to bear, and Marky decided it was time to leave Earth behind and finally confront the Emperor of Viltrum. So, Marky tracked his father down, and driven by a blind, desperate rage, Marky launched a brutal assault on his father. The battle was fierce, but as the fight dragged on, the wall of anger Marky had built around his heart began to crack. The violence eventually sputtered out, leaving both Mark and Marky exhausted and battered, lying amidst the smouldering rubble of their battlefield. In the quiet aftermath, the truth finally poured out. Marky laid bare the decades of isolation he had felt, explaining how he felt abandoned on Earth while his sister, Terra, lived a life of prestige. He confessed the darkest thoughts he had carried, the belief that while Terra was a product of love, he was merely a product of hate, a living reminder of the trauma Anissa had inflicted upon Mark. He felt he was a mistake that his father wanted to keep at a distance. However, Mark's response was of profound pride. He explained that he hadn't left Marky on Earth to get rid of him, but to give him the greatest gift he could offer, the chance to grow up with a human perspective, just as Mark had. He wanted Marky to experience life, empathy, and the value of protecting others without the burden of the Viltrumite crown looming over his childhood. Mark looked at his son and told him that seeing everything Marky had done for Earth filled him with more pride than he could put into words. Overwhelmed, Marky broke down in tears. The weight of his guilt crushed him. He realized he had lost control and, in his fury, could have actually killed his own father. He asked how he could ever hope to forgive himself for such a betrayal. Mark reached out to him and told him that they had all the time in the universe to heal, to talk, and to build the relationship they both deserved. While the comics don't show us exactly what Marky does after this moment, the implication is clear. The misunderstanding was finally over. Marky likely returned to Earth for a time, finally at peace with his dual heritage. So, that's all for this video, and if you guys think I forgot something, make sure to tell me in the comment section.